Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your real guide to African news. And today we'll be discussing the significance of exchange programs, not only in Zimbabwe, but the rest of Africa. My name is Jeffrey Mrimbechi, and later on we'll be with two fantastic guests to find out what's happening between the bilateral relationship, fruitful bilateral relationship between Zimbabwe and Japan. It stretches beyond the car that you're driving, but it goes beyond that into infrastructure, culture, and a lot more, and our guests will help us break this down. But we start off by taking a look at what's happening across the continent, and once again we go to Central Africa, where it's all about storytelling in the DRC. And in the streets of the Democratic Republic of Congo, groups of creatives are beginning to work on storytelling, and it is now a part of their life. A resource center was established in Port Noir, which trains and equips storytellers. And by storytellers, we're not only talking about Ngano and folktale, we're talking about those that create content, those that represent what is actually happening in the DRC. And these programs are designed to revitalize storytelling at a time when the art is losing ground in many African societies. We have seen that a lot of our African nations and a lot of our broadcasters and even algorithms online have been showing us Western content. And one of the architects of these initiatives is Yuras Mabiala, who acknowledges the work done to mobilize people around storytelling in their own country. And as the world is celebrating International Storytelling Day, it is a chance to reflect on how to export storytelling beyond our African countries, beyond each country's borders, and then letting people know a little bit more about your country. So from wherever you're watching from, if you are able to tell the Zimbabwean story in the best light, who knows, you might have people flocking by to get to know more about that. Now we move to Gambia, where in Gambia has taken steps towards a ban on female circumcision. Politicians in the West African Nations Parliament voted to advance the controversial bill, which would repeal a landmark 2015 ban on female genital mutilation that made the practice punishable by up to 3 years in prison. Alamir Giba, the legislator who introduced the bill, argued that the ban violated the citizens' rights to practice their culture and religion, something that is really questionable. And you can give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page, that is ZBC News Online, and we're also available on Twitter as well as TikTok. Now, this bill seeks to uphold religious loyalty and safeguard cultural norms and values, said the legislator. But activists and rights associations say the proposed legislation reverses years of progress that has been made towards preventing damaging of a country's human rights record. And the bill is now set to sit in Parliament, and we'll give you an update on that. And we now touch down back home. Well, it's all smiles as President Mnangagwa officially opened the 9th African Diamond Producers Association meeting in Victoria Falls. He said that Africa should take pride in its resources and to protect the prices of its diamonds and to benefit from the resources through value addition and industrialization. And by this, the president was talking about beyond sending ore, beyond sending rough-cut diamonds, why not produce those final pieces straight from Africa? You will get more value, up to 10-fold. Now, there was also a call for exploration of new minerals, for new strategies to be developed to benefit African people. Botswana's Democratic Secretary General Comrade Khavis Kariu, who attended the meeting and said former liberation movements must come together and ignite the spirit of togetherness and support each other in times of need. Now, you do know about Zimbabwe beating its landmark $12 billion mining economy. Now, imagine if this is spread across all 54 nations in Africa, across all minerals. Think about it. Now, we'll talk about this and a lot more, but we'll be diving into the relationship between Zimbabwe and the rest of the world and how this can be duplicated in the new African consciousness. This is Focus 54. Stay tuned for episode 2. Welcome back to Focus 54. I know I gave you quite a lot to digest in the first segment, but we are back again. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi, and this time I am joined by international relations expert, Mr. Clive Chiriza, as well as Justice Mufiri, a brilliant young man, and he's all about African affairs. We've had him on the show, and he gave us some mind-opening and some thought-provoking nuggets. Gentlemen, welcome to Focus 54.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have both of you on the show because, you know, when we speak of, in the streets, when we speak of Zimbabwe and Japan, the first thing is people think of two things. Culturally, we saw martial arts on TV and on the streets.
Samurai.
And samurais, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And when we talk about what we see on the streets, a lot of Japanese cars, but it stretches beyond this, and that's why we have you two fine gentlemen on Focus 54. Now, the Japanese university students affiliated with Millennium Promise Japan, which is called the MJP, a non-profit organization supporting development in Africa, were in here for a 2-week tour of Zimbabwe, where they learned the country's history and the culture. Can you share your perspective on this? Why is this important for Japanese students to come to what, you know, everyone calls the third world, Zimbabwe? Why do they want to know about our culture and our history?
Okay.
I'll start off with you, Clive.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, that is a very interesting question per se. Let me say I'm quite privileged to be in attendance of most of the seminars conducted by one of our own, that is Brigadier General Dr. Alaki Basi Bangidza. And so rarely does he conclude his sessions without making an emphasis of a motion that was pushed through the British Parliament back then in 1835 by Lord Macaulay. Macaulay says, I quote, I've traveled across the length and the breadth of Africa. I've seen people who are of high moral fiber and caliber. I have not seen a thief, neither have I seen a beggar. Such wealth have I seen. And he ends up saying, I think it would be very difficult for us to conquer such a country unless if we are going to be successful in breaking the very backbone of this nation, which happens to be their culture and their spiritual heritage. And so he says, I prefer that we replace her old and ancient education system as well as culture, so that he becomes exactly what we want them to become, a true dominated nation. Because so long as they end up thinking that everything that is foreign and English is more superior and better and important than theirs, we would have successfully dominated them, close quote. This was Macaulay back then in 1835, just before the colonization of Africa. And it would surprise many that before Africa was colonized, at the heart of the strategy was culture. And from this, we need to know that subjugation does not begin at gunpoint, but at intrusion of a culture. This is how...
And the mindset, I believe. Exactly.
This is how culture
Well, the Japanese are our friends. We're now in a modern era, and we actually have this information. You've clarified the importance of this. Why are they then doing it, the Japanese?
Okay. The sole reason why they are doing this, Jeff, you need to understand that in international relations, you get what you want in 3 ways. Firstly, by force or coercion. Secondly, by payment. Thirdly, by attraction or persuasion. And for the argument of this debate and discourse, I'll dwell much on the third aspect, which is by attraction and persuasion. This constitutes soft power. And soft power is a tool of statecraft in diplomacy, where you use the persuasion to attain whatever you want to attain.
And we call that kuwirirana.
Exactly. And it's actually influenced by some of these practices like cultural exchanges as well as policy initiatives. So this is quite important in as much as the pursuit of interest is concerned, especially by state actors.
Well, I want to throw this one to Justice. Justice, in the same aspect, when we introduced you two gentlemen, I spoke about samurais, and we spoke about that. Quite recently, diplomats from Japan and the Judo Society of Zimbabwe came together, and we got a grant to build a judoka, a dojo, I believe, where a center of excellence for judo. I think this comes from a lot of our senseis winning awards internationally and things like that. And very recently, the Japanese government and the Zimbabwean government having come together collaboratively and putting in a mega $1 million deals in terms of infrastructure. How does that tie into that culture aspect? Because we've seen this happening with the Chinese. How does this tie into our economic aspirations?
Yeah, I think the discourse on economic gains or economics is incomplete without the precast of cultural relations. Because for you to be able to have an economic relation with somebody, that's trade, that's your subsistence, what you do for a living, there is need for a common understanding between the two trading partners. A common understanding is usually found on the cultural grounds of those people. So now maybe we need to define what that culture then is. I think it's the collective of the values, the norms, the way of life of a people, those things that they learn, that they share, that they transmit from one generation to the next. And I think for the African, it then speaks to those outside of the values which we have as a people, outside of the behaviors which we learn, the Ubuntu aspect that we always emphasize on, the values that we have as a society. If there is a clicking point between that which we believe in and that which the next person believes in, then there is a common ground for us to then have an economic understanding. So culture is a currency. It is that originality of where you come from that will amaze the next person. You was talking about diplomacy and says through attraction, that is how you can then get to trade with others. So that attraction, you don't attract when you are trying to imitate that which the next person is doing, because then there's nothing new you are bringing to the table. So it's us being original to our culture, and then we have these interstate relations, especially with Japan.
I will bring the issue of language because, in December 2023, there was a visit, and they were talking about the visit at the Tokyo University of Foreign Languages. In Zimbabwe, let's talk about some of the trade hubs in Harare and places like that. I've met people from China who now speak a couple of Shona words, I went to a restaurant and one of the owners was a Chinese person, was speaking in Shona, and they were calling it Seguru, they were calling him Seguru, things like that. How does that tie in the issues of language? Are we just giving them our culture? Is it important for us to just give them our perspective of our own culture? Or does it have to be 50-50? You learn my language, my culture, and I learn about yours. How does that work in diplomacy?
Okay, I want to agree with what my colleague here has just said in terms of culture. Jeff, do you know that of late, even economists, they are now becoming culture sensitive in as much as they make their validation and even come up with different kinds of hypotheses. I would give an example of Jeffrey Sachs in his book, The End of Poverty. He actually encourages the governments to make sure they factor in the culture component in as much as they try to advance their entire nations and even in pursuit of their interests. So culture is quite important. And also in cultural diplomacy, it's not about one group entirely imposing its culture on another. No, this is an effort to know each other, tolerate each other, relate with each other, come up to a common consensus, find the common roots of humanity, and out of that, every other deal comes out positively. This is how it is.
So we've understood this element, and as we break off this segment, I want to talk about research and the power of money.
Okay.
We have known that, and the information is out there, that most of the times he who funds the research has the research agreeing with them. And we want to talk about culture. He who funds the culture oftenly has someone influencing that, and we'll be talking about that and a very sensitive topic as we get into the third segment. For now, Focus 54 takes a short break. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Focus 54. We're now in our third segment where we touch on the more sensitive issues, and I am joined by these two fine gentlemen, Clive Chiridza and Justice Mfiri, our international relations experts who are helping us break down and understand the bilateral relationships between Zimbabwe and Japan. But before we closed off the second segment, we are now touching on the issue on who influences cultural practices, especially when the other party has a lot of influence. We have seen that certain poorer nations have been sanctioned, have been controlled by other people because they had to influence culture. We'll give, for example, Uganda, then they have very strong stance against the LGBTQI community and the backlash that they got influence from that. As Africans, how do we preserve our cultural preferences, our cultural norms without being influenced too much by those that have more money than us?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because when we were discussing the issue of the culture, we said it should be a mutual understanding. So then that means that the cultural values from one end should be in correspondence with those on the other hand. What that means is, I think in particular focus on the Japanese-Zimbabwe relations that we are discussing in this context. That's very important because both parties do not believe in the LGBTQ, for example, what you are mentioning. So then that makes good grounds for a good trading relation between the two countries. Speak of geospatial science, we have already seen the development out of the relations that we have. ZIMSTAT-1, we launched our satellite November of 2022 with the assistance of the Japanese. You were talking about superiority and inferiority.
And I understand that our local engineers, one of them who used to be at ZBC,
yes,
were granted scholarships and studied under Japanese technicians and,
that's
and
true.
experts.
It is our people who were involved in that project with the assistance of the Japanese. So when people saw the Zimbabwe National Geospatial and Space Agency being set up at UZ as part of the Education 5.0 program, people didn't quite realize that where was it going. So now Zimbabwe has a space presence, and that is a direct result of the mutual understanding that we have with the Japanese. So we were the point I was driving now to is, you were saying there is an element of superiority and inferiority when we talk of interstate relations and how nations then relate on the table of economic grounds. I believe that there is no superior culture when we talk of cultures, because every culture is original to its people, and it speaks to what they believe in and what their experience is as relevant to their geographical location and what they deem and their interpretation of the cosmos. So really there's no superiority complex, if I may say, when it comes to the relations.
Prior to this, Clive came through with something that was, I think, it changed my perspective of international relations. Said, to start business, you have to start with the culture. I believe there was a consortium of companies that came from the United States, and they met with business people here through the CEO's round table. And one of the ladies representing Zimbabwe said that people deal with people they're familiar with. And I think she was talking about the cultural aspect. Already, the Chirundu Highway is one of the, I'll say, the hottest project that's going on right now.
True.
And the Japanese people have funded this significantly. Clive, why would they do that?
Yeah, well, Jeff, this is the reality in international politics and relations, and even in diplomacy. There is no free lunch in international relations. It's all about pursuit of the national interests. And in this case, we have an Asian country coming to interface with Zimbabwe. Let's take a look at the geopolitical setting internationally as we
Because I understand if we are aligned.
Exactly. We have the two major powers, the Western and the Eastern Bloc, who in reality are fighting for superiority, and both blocs all want to attain a hegemonic position in the globe. And to do that, they would always need a buy-in of other states. And the positioning of Africa right now, as we speak, it's the hub of raw materials worldwide. And it's quite unfortunate that we haven't realized how important and significant we are, especially when it comes to global events. I'll give you an example of the Ukraine and Russia war. Rarely would you find Africa being invited to come and make a contribution as to how they can mitigate that situation, which is catastrophic in the East. Why? Because they believe we are not, in quotes, technologically advanced, we are not developed per se. But the guns, bombs, the nuclear weapons they are using, the raw materials are coming from Africa. So it's high time that we need to realize our position in the international scene. And like I said, it could be the reason why the Japanese want to interface with Africa. It gives them better positioning in as much as the geopolitical landscape is concerned.
Do we not also need Japanese manufacturing culture, Japanese technology for us as we are aspiring for an upper middle income economy by 2030 to say let's work with these people, because they know they have been manufacturing cars and manufacturing things much better than we have. Does it not work that way?
You are quite right. I was then coming to that point, that we always need each other for us to develop. Here we are dealing with the second largest Asian and fourth largest the international economy in as much as GDP is concerned. This is a 4.2 trillion United States dollar economy, a superpower in manufacturing. And for your own information, they've got also other sub-industries that are actually feeding into their export index as well as their GDP, which could be of very much importance to us other than the cars you've mentioned before. We talk of the pharmaceutical industry, the petrochemical industry, bioindustry, aerospace, as my colleague had mentioned. So it could be very important for us as Zimbabweans to also tap into that repository of the Japanese economy, so that at the end of the day, we develop our own nation.
So just as, as we talk about Vision 2030, it's not only a Zimbabwean concept. As you mentioned in a previous program here on Focus 54, you did mention that it is a template that other African nations are looking at. Can we safely say that Japan is a good big brother to Zimbabwe and the rest of the African countries? And why should everyone jump onto this goodwill and this state of, I would say, Ubuntu that we're sharing with the Japanese?
Yes, it's an important observation that you're making. And speaking of interstate relations, Uganda and Zimbabwe are the two countries that were launching satellites on that Japanese-assisted thing. So that tells you that Japan is not even only involved in Zimbabwe, but also involved on the rest of the African continent. They hold interfaces where they bring together all those African states to talk about the issues that matter, and that's the economy. That's unlike some of the world powers. When they come together with you, they want to talk about other issues which are not a priority.
So what you're saying to me is that the Japanese are coming through as economic partners, cultural partners, cultural friendlies. They are not they don't have an agenda to influence our local policies, our politics, our policies,
an
our
agenda,
laws.
or even to change our understanding of the self. Speaking of how the cultural and social integration can then translate to business and economic benefits, this north-south corridor that we are talking about, it's projected to be one of the busiest road trunks in the region, that's SADC. And that places Zimbabwe at the hub of trade activity that's going to be happening by 2040. And that's a projection.
So ideally,
by the
first
African Union.
preference as a friendly is he who helped us attain this new Silk Route. I want to call it
Yes,
that,
yeah,
and I hope
yes.
I won't be quoted badly.
Yes.
But then let's talk
We're
about
calling it the
politically.
north-south corridor.
We've pretty much talked about the cultural aspect and the economic aspect. Politically, are we safe from Japanese influence? The Japanese coming through to say, look, this is how we're going to influence your domestic policy and foreign policy.
Actually, Jeff, in every form of interface, there's always going to be some setbacks and disadvantages. But here we have to focus on the positives, especially us as Zimbabweans who still have got a lot to learn from large economies like Japan. You know, I would borrow the words of the late Walter Rodney. May his soul actually continue to rest in peace. As he was talking about economic development, he says, according to him, and I believe this is economic development in its truest sense, he says economic development should be guided by these underlying foundational issues. A people should be able to understand the laws of nature, and then this speaks to science. And after that, they should be able to extract resources. This speaks to the availability of raw materials. And then they should be able to convert them to usable and useful tools. We are now talking about what? Beneficiation as well as value addition and technology. And finally, he says, those same people should be able to organize their work properly. And then this speaks to the insertion of functional systems. And these are things that we need to learn from the bigger brother. Quite important to us. And if we are able to achieve these, only can we say we are now masters of our own destiny. We can actually indigenize our own economy fully, industrialize, and then work on mitigation of unemployment and some poverty, and be rest assured that this has to improve and increase our Human Development Index.
Clive and Justice, unfortunately, time is the biggest resource that no person on earth can control. But I believe that you can find these two gentlemen online and get to interact with them and interrogate them for their thoughts. Clive Chiridza and Justice Mufiri, you can find them online, very active and young people that will be able to answer your questions. This has been Focus 54, where we've pretty much summed up the beautiful and blossoming relationship beyond culture and economies between Zimbabwe and Japan. And may we multiply this beauty of a relationship to all 54 nations. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. Catch me on the next episode.